The story begins not with conquest, but with cold. In the year 750 after Christ, a family huddles in their longhouse somewhere along the Norwegian coast as winter darkness swallows 18 hours of each day. Outside, temperatures plunge to depths that crack stone and freeze breath before it leaves the mouth. Inside, survival depends entirely on 10 implements that have defined Scandinavian existence for generations, tools so essential that Viking law prescribed death for stealing them, and families buried them with honored dead to ensure comfort in the afterlife. The fire steel and flint rest beside the hearth, guarded more carefully than silver. Without them, this family dies within days. A Viking woman strikes steel against stone in practiced rhythm, coaxing sparks into waiting tinder. Each spark represents captured flame. Ancient Norse believed these flashes held Loki's fire, trickster stolen from the gods and tamed for mortal use. The physics are simple, but the consequences absolute. Reliable ignition in Scandinavia's damp climate means survival, while dependence on friction methods means death. This single tool solved the fundamental energy problem that had killed countless families in earlier centuries. Hanging on the wall, the family axe gleams with fresh whale oil polish. This implement cleared the forest that once stood where their farm now stretches. It split every log that burns in their fire. It shaped every timber in their home's frame. When raiders came 3 summers ago, it split shields and skulls with equal efficiency. A Viking axe serves triple duty: agriculture, construction, and combat. Its value exceeds that of 3 milk cows, yet every household must possess one or perish. The head is forged from bog iron pulled from nearby marshes, where ancient plant matter transformed groundwater into usable ore over thousands of years. The ash wood handle was cut when the farmer was a boy, seasoned for a decade before fitting. This axe will outlive its owner and pass to his son already waiting to inherit. The CX knife never leaves the farmer's belt. 7 inches of steel, sharp enough to shave with, this blade has cut food for 10,000 meals, carved wooden toys for children, skinned animals from rabbits to reindeer, defended its owner in 2 knife fights, and will eventually accompany him into his burial mound. Every free Viking man owns a seax from age 12 until death. Boys receive their first blade in ceremonies that transform them from children into oath-takers. The knife becomes an extension of identity. Many warriors name their blades and attribute personalities to them. This particular CX is called Biter, and it has drawn blood in service to its family. Beside the door, fishing gear waits for morning. Horsehair lines strong as sinew, bone hooks carved with microscopic precision, lead weights shaped to sink just so. These implements represent the difference between plenty and starvation in a land where growing seasons last barely 4 months. The North Atlantic teems with cod, herring, and salmon protein sources requiring far less land and labor than livestock husbandry. A skilled fisherman with proper gear can feed his family for a week from a single successful day. The hooks themselves embody generations of accumulated knowledge, their angle, their gap, their point, each dimension optimized through centuries of trial and death. Get the hook size wrong and entire families starve. Get it right and children grow strong. The cooking cauldron squats beside the fire, blackened from decades of use. This iron vessel is the family's most valuable possession after their farm itself. Inside, yesterday's mutton stews with dried seaweed and barley, transforming tough meat into tender sustenance through hours of patient boiling. The cauldron enables food preservation through smoking and salting, extending summer's harvest across winter's scarcity. It serves ceremonial functions, too. Every feast, every celebration, every oath-taking begins with communal eating from this vessel. When this family's grandmother died, the cauldron appeared in her funeral rites, symbolizing her decades of feeding children, grandchildren, and guests. Some cauldrons possess names and histories spanning centuries, passed mother to daughter through generations. Against the wall lean woodworking tools that built everything in this dwelling. The adze that shaped roof beams, the auger that drilled peg holes, the plane that smoothed planks. Scandinavia possesses one abundant resource: timber, and these implements transform trees into homes, boats, furniture, and trade goods. The farmer crafted this year's new door using tools his grandfather wielded. In spring, he will join neighbors to build a new longship using these same implements. Viking woodworking technology will eventually enable construction of vessels that reach Byzantium, Baghdad, and North America, all because these simple tools extract maximum value from northern forests. The whetstone rests in its place of honor near the axe. This rectangular block of precisely textured stone maintains every edged tool's effectiveness. A sharp axe requires 30% less force per strike than a dull one across thousands of cuts. This efficiency compounds into the difference between prosperity and poverty. Sharpening is sacred work, associated with Thor's strength. Many Vikings speak prayers while honing blades, requesting divine blessing for the implements that stand between their families and death. This particular whetstone came from a famous quarry in southern Norway, traded for 3 sheep fleeces 5 years ago. It will sharpen tools for 3 generations before wearing smooth. The woman's work area holds wool shears, spindles, needles, and thread implements outsiders dismiss as domestic trivialities, but which actually generate Scandinavia's primary trade commodity. High-quality wool textiles fund Viking expansion by creating wealth to purchase weapons, ships, and supplies. The shears that clip sheep each June are precision instruments requiring years to master. The needles that stitch clothing are hand-forged from iron wire, each one representing hours of careful smithing. Through these implements, women control substantial economic power. The embroidery patterns stitched into every garment carry meaning, family history, social status, and cosmic beliefs rendered in thread. A daughter learns needlework from her mother and grandmother in teaching chains stretching back centuries, knowledge preserved in skilled hands rather than written words. Finally, the water vessels. Wooden stave-built buckets sealed with pine tar, horn cups polished smooth, and one precious soapstone bowl acquired through trade. These containers solve transportation and storage challenges that plague other medieval cultures. The stave construction technique, individual vertical planks bound by willow hoops, creates vessels that flex without leaking, essential for carrying water across uneven ground or through rough seas. Water itself holds sacred significance in Norse belief, associated with purity, wisdom, and the Well of Erd, where fate itself originates. These 10 tool categories, fire steel and flint, axe, CX knife, fishing gear, cooking cauldron, woolworking implements, needle and thread, whetstone, woodworking tools, and water vessels emerged from centuries of brutal selection. Every generation experimented, innovated, and died until only the most effective solutions survived. By 750 after Christ, this toolkit had reached optimization. The Viking Age was about to begin, and these humble implements would enable the most dramatic expansion in medieval European history. On June 8, 793 after Christ, Viking axes bit into the monastery doors at Lindisfarne, and Europe's understanding of warfare changed forever. But this raid and the 3 centuries of expansion that followed succeeded not because Vikings were fiercer than their enemies, but because their tools were better. Consider the longship that carried raiders to Lindisfarne's shore. Every plank was shaped by specialized woodworking tools perfected over generations. Adzes that could shave timber to precise thickness, augers that drilled rivet holes at exact angles, planes that smoothed surfaces until they shed water like duck feathers. Building a longship required 3 months of intensive labor by master craftsmen, each wielding tools inherited from their fathers. The result was a vessel that could cross the North Sea in any weather, navigate rivers barely 3 feet deep, and beach on any shoreline without docks. This strategic mobility gave Vikings advantages that medieval Europe's heavier, deeper-drafted ships could never match. Within 2 weeks sailing from Scandinavia, no coastal target was safe. But ships required crews, and crews required provisions. The fishing gear that fed coastal raiders represented technology as sophisticated as the weapons they carried. Viking long lines, multiple hooks suspended from single main lines, could harvest cod by the hundreds from deep Atlantic waters. The hooks themselves were carved from bone or forged from iron, their shapes optimized through centuries of trial. Fishermen could read water like others read books, knowing where currents carried prey, how depth affected biting patterns, and which moon phases brought fish to surface. This expertise transformed the sea from barrier into breadbasket, enabling Viking settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and beyond, places where agriculture alone could never sustain populations. The raids generated massive wealth: silver, slaves, precious objects, and fertile land. This capital funded the next phase settlement. In 874 after Christ, Norse families began colonizing Iceland with complete toolkits essential for perthry, establishing farms in this volcanic treeless landscape. Every ship carried axes, knives, fishing gear, cauldrons, wool-working implements, needles, whetstones, and precious iron tools for woodworking. Families also carried fire steel and flint, knowing that in Iceland's damp climate, maintaining flame meant survival. Iceland tested the Viking toolkit's limits. With virtually no timber, settlers adapted by maximizing driftwood and importing lumber from Norway. Woodworking tools became even more precious, used to build turf-roofed longhouses instead of the timber halls they'd left behind. Fishing implements dominated daily life since agriculture could barely support the growing population. Yet the settlements thrived, proving that the 10 essential tools could sustain civilization even in hostile environments if wielded with skill and knowledge. The CX knife evolved into a symbol of Viking identity during this expansion period. Warriors named their blades Legbiter, Skull Splitter, Blood Drinker. These weren't merely weapons, but companions that shared their owner's fate. Saga literature records specific CX knives appearing across generations, their histories becoming family legends. One famous blade, called Grafeld, meaning greyskin, served 5 generations of Norwegian chieftains, each adding silver inlay to commemorate their greatest victories. When the last owner died in 982 after Christ, the knife was buried with him despite being worth 20 prime cattle. Such was the bond between Viking and blade. In the Danelaw, the region of England under Viking control from the late 800s onward, these 10 tools shaped daily life for both conquerors and conquered. Viking settlers brought superior agricultural techniques enabled by their implements. Their axes cleared land faster than Anglo-Saxon equivalents because Norse smiths had perfected the balance between weight and sharpness. Their whetstones, quarried from Norway's finest deposits, maintained edges that English stones couldn't match. Anglo-Saxon farmers began copying Viking tool designs, recognizing their efficiency advantages. Gradually, cultural distinctions blurred as technology transferred from conqueror to conquered. The wool trade transformed Scandinavia's economy during these centuries. Viking shears, crafted from forge-welded steel, cut sheep fleece cleanly without damaging animals' skin, crucial for maintaining healthy flocks. The shearing happened each June in massive communal events where entire settlements gathered, songs preserving the rhythm of work as hundreds of sheep moved through skilled hands. Women processed the wool through carding, spinning, and weaving, months of labor condensed into textiles so fine that Byzantine merchants paid premium prices. This trade generated wealth that funded military expeditions, purchased land, and elevated Scandinavia from Europe's backwater to a power rivaling established empires. The cooking cauldron became central to Viking diplomatic culture during this era. When jarls and kings met to forge alliances, negotiate treaties, or settle disputes, communal feasting cemented agreements. The host's cauldron fed hundreds of guests, its size and quality reflecting the chieftain's wealth and generosity. Mead and ale flowed from drinking horns, but the meal itself boiled mutton, root vegetables, and barley bubbled in iron vessels that had served families for generations. To accept food from another's cauldron created obligations of hospitality and honor. To poison that food violated cosmic law, inviting divine punishment. Greenland represented the Viking toolkit's ultimate test. When Eric the Red established settlements in 985 after Christ, he led families to a land where survival margins left no room for error. The fishing gear had to function perfectly, or families starved before winter ended. Fire, steel, and flint had to create flame in Arctic conditions, or settlers froze in darkness lasting 20 hours daily. Axes and woodworking tools maximized every scrap of driftwood found on desolate shores. The cooking cauldron enabled preservation of meat through freezing, simply hanging butchered animals outside where temperatures kept them fresh for months. Yet Greenland also revealed the toolkit's limitations. The Vikings encountered indigenous peoples, ancestors of modern Inuit, whose tools surpassed Norse implements for Arctic survival. Inuit hunters used toggling harpoons far superior to Viking fishing spears for catching seals and walruses. Their skin clothing, sewn with sinew thread and bone needles, provided better insulation than wool. Their soapstone lamps, burning seal oil, generated heat more efficiently than wood fires. Vikings faced a choice: adapt by adopting indigenous technology or maintain cultural purity by relying exclusively on ancestral tools. Most chose purity, and that choice would eventually doom them. Around the year 1000 after Christ, Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland with 35 companions, carrying the complete Viking toolkit into waters no Norse ship had crossed. They reached Vinland somewhere along North America's northeastern coast and attempted settlement. Every essential implement came ashore: axes to fell timber, fishing gear to harvest unknown waters, fire steel to establish hearths, cauldrons to process food, tools to build shelters. For a few years, the settlement functioned. Then conflict with indigenous peoples, combined with Vinland's remoteness from supply sources, forced abandonment. The toolkit that conquered Europe and colonized Iceland proved insufficient to sustain permanent settlement in the New World. By the mid-1100s, the Viking Age was ending. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 killed Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, whose legendary axe called Riva had split shields from Norway to Constantinople. Christianization was eroding pagan rituals that had sustained tool-making traditions. The economic model of raiding and settling was failing as European kingdoms organized effective defenses. But the 10 essential tools survived, transitioning from implements of conquest to anchors of cultural identity. As political Viking power dissolved between 1066 and 1200 after Christ, the 10 essential tools transformed from weapons of expansion into threads connecting scattered Norse peoples to their heritage. The longships that once carried raiders now transported peaceful merchants. The axes that cleared forests for new settlements now simply cleared forests for farming. The CX knives that defended shield walls now just skinned animals and carved wood. Yet in this apparent decline lay unexpected resilience. The tools outlasted the empire they'd built. In Iceland, isolation preserved Viking culture in remarkable purity. With no native peoples to conquer and no external enemies to resist, Icelandic families maintained traditions that mainland Scandinavia was abandoning. The complete toolkit remained essential for survival. Fishing gear harvested the rich Atlantic waters. Woolworking tools produced textiles for trade and warmth. Cooking cauldrons prepared the preserved foods that sustained life through winter darkness. But Iceland's unique contribution was transforming oral culture into written form. Beginning in the 1100s, Icelandic scholars began recording the sagas, stories that had preserved history for centuries. These sagas reveal how deeply tools were woven into Viking identity. The saga of Grettir, the Strong, describes his legendary short sword, Jökull's blade, in loving detail. Its balance, its edge, the silver inlay depicting ravens, and most importantly, its history through 5 owners before reaching Grettir's hand. The saga of the Volsungs treats the sword Gram as a character with agency and destiny. When archaeologists excavate Viking graves and find elaborate weapons buried with their owners, they're uncovering not just tools but relationships. A warrior and his blade were partners in a very real sense. The Christianization of Scandinavia created fascinating tensions around tool culture. The church initially opposed pagan practices associated with metalworking. Prayers to Thor while sharpening weapons, sacrifices before major smithing projects, runes carved into blade tangs for magical protection. Yet Christianity needed smiths to create church bells, crosses, and decorative metalwork. Pragmatic bishops reached accommodations. The craftsmanship continued, but the ceremonies were sanitized. Instead of invoking Thor, smiths blessed their work in Christ's name. The fundamental techniques, passed from master to apprentice through demonstration rather than writing, survived intact. Monastic communities became unlikely preservers of Viking tool technology. Cistercian monasteries, established across Scandinavia during the 1200s, maintained sophisticated metalworking operations. Monks forged axes, ploughs, and other implements using methods descended directly from Norse smiths. The monastery's written records, rare for this period, document tool-making processes in detail. A 1230 manuscript from a Swedish monastery describes tempering techniques for knife blades that match archaeological evidence from 3 centuries earlier. Christianity had absorbed and preserved what it initially sought to replace. On mainland Scandinavia, tool ownership and skill increasingly determined social status as warrior culture faded. A wealthy farmer's identity came not from battles fought, but from the quality of his implements and the skill with which he used them. Families invested in superior axes, paying premium prices for blades forged by famous smiths. The whetstone rituals, once associated with preparing for combat, now focused on agricultural efficiency. A sharp scythe harvested a grain faster, a honed plane smoothed timber cleaner, a keen knife butchered animals more precisely. Women's roles in tool culture gained visibility during this period as military concerns diminished. The wool industry, always economically crucial, now received the recognition it deserved. Iceland's law codes from the 1300s specify minimum acceptable quality for textile production, detailing thread count, weaving tightness, and color fastness. These regulations reveal woolworking as skilled profession, requiring years of training. The shears, spindles, and needles that created these textiles were professional implements, maintained and valued accordingly. Trade networks spread Viking tool designs far beyond Scandinavian borders during this era. Norse merchants carried their implements throughout Europe, and other cultures copied what worked. English smiths began producing axes using Scandinavian techniques. Russian craftsmen adopted Viking woodworking tools for boat construction. Even Constantinople's weapon makers studied Norse CX designs, recognizing their balance and utility. Technology transfer occurred not through conquest, but through the simple fact that superior tools outcompete inferior ones, regardless of cultural origin. The Greenland colonies tell a darker story of tool limitation and cultural rigidity. As climate cooled during the 1300s, the beginning of the Little Ice Age, traditional Viking tools and techniques became increasingly inadequate. Archaeological excavations reveal the progression toward collapse. Early period sites contain balanced collections of all 10 tool categories, but later sites are dominated by fishing implements as agriculture failed. The settlers caught more seal and walrus, trying to compensate for vanishing cattle and sheep. They acquired some Inuit technology. Toggle harpoons appear alongside Viking fishing gear in late-period deposits, but the adaptation came too slowly and too partially. The last written record from Greenland's Norse settlers dates to 1410 after Christ, a marriage certificate inscribed in a church register. After that, silence. When European ships finally returned in the early 1500s, they found abandoned farms with household goods still in place, cooking cauldrons beside cold hearths, axes hanging on walls, fishing gear coiled by doors, wool shears lying where they'd last been set down. The inhabitants had vanished, died out, fled, or possibly integrated with Inuit populations. Their tools remained, carefully arranged as if awaiting owners who would never return. Iceland survived because its larger population enabled specialization and trade networks that distributed risk. A failed fishing season in one region could be compensated by surplus grain from another. Specialist craftsmen, dedicated smiths, expert weavers, master woodworkers maintained quality as general competence declined. The 10 essential tools remained essential, but their use became increasingly professional rather than universal. On mainland Scandinavia, the 1400s brought the final transformation. The Black Death devastated populations, killing perhaps half of Norway's people between 1349 and 1351. Labor shortages paradoxically increased the value of tool skills. Surviving craftsmen could demand premium wages. Metal tools became heirlooms marked with family crests and names. their continuity providing psychological stability amid catastrophic change. The printing press arrived in Scandinavia during the late 1400s, and with it came the first printed manuals describing tool use and maintenance. What had been exclusively oral knowledge, passed master to apprentice, now appeared on pages available to anyone literate. This democratization of knowledge changed skill transmission fundamentally. Young craftsmen could study techniques from multiple sources rather than single masters. Quality, standardized as best practices spread through written word. Yet something was also lost: the intimate teaching relationship, the secrets shared only with chosen apprentices, the embodied knowledge that lived in skilled hands rather than written descriptions. By 1500 after Christ, the Viking Age was 5 centuries gone, but the 10 essential tools persisted. They had transitioned from enabling conquest to anchoring identity, from symbols of pagan warrior culture to markers of Christian peasant competence. The tools outlasted the empire because they solved fundamental human problems: how to make fire, cut materials, harvest food, prepare meals, create clothing, and maintain effectiveness. These challenges didn't end when the longships stopped sailing. The tools survived because efficiency has no expiration date. In the year 2025, people across the globe use knives, axes, and fishing gear descended directly from Viking innovations, often without knowing their heritage. The story of these 10 essential implements didn't end when political Viking power collapsed. It merely changed form, flowing like underground rivers through centuries of history to surface in unexpected places. Consider the modern Scandinavian knife called the puukko in Finland, or the tollekniv in Norway. These blades are direct descendants of the Viking CX, same blade length, same single edge, same general-purpose design philosophy. Contemporary craftsmen forge puukkos using techniques documented in medieval manuscripts, creating knives that would be instantly recognizable to a Viking smith from 1,000 years ago. The handles now use modern materials like stabilized wood or synthetic compounds, but the fundamental form remains unchanged because it was optimized centuries ago. The fishing industry reveals even clearer lineages. Long-line fishing, multiple hooks suspended from a main line, was pioneered by Viking-age Scandinavians and remains standard practice in 40-60 turn commercial fisheries worldwide. The hooks themselves have been refined through modern metallurgy, but their shapes and angles descend from designs perfected by Norse craftsmen who understood that tiny variations in hook geometry meant the difference between feast and famine. When modern fishermen in Iceland, Norway, or Newfoundland set their lines, their executing strategies developed 1,500 years ago. Shipbuilding technology preserves Viking innovations in surprising ways. The clinker-built construction method, overlapping planks, fastened with rivets that defined longship construction, influenced European maritime expansion for centuries. Portuguese caravels that explored Africa's coast during the 1400s used clinker techniques. English vessels that defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588 employed construction principles traceable to Viking shipwrights. Even modern wooden boats occasionally use clinker construction because for certain applications it remains superior to later innovations. The woodworking tools that built those longships, adzes, augers, planes, exist today in forms Vikings would recognize instantly. The archaeological record continues revealing Viking tool sophistication. In 1904, excavators uncovered the Oseberg ship in Norway, a burial vessel containing an aristocratic woman and her servant, sealed in clay since 834 after Christ. The preservation was extraordinary. Wooden objects, textiles, and metal tools survived in usable condition after 11 centuries. The woodworking tools particularly astonished researchers: the precision of their manufacture, the sophistication of their design, the evidence of master craftsmanship. Museums now display these implements beside modern equivalents, and the similarities are striking. A Viking adze from 834 differs from a 2025 adze primarily in handle material and manufacturing process, not in fundamental design. More recent discoveries continue enriching understanding. In 2019, archaeologists excavating a Norwegian mountain pass discovered a complete Viking tool cache preserved in retreating ice. Climate change is exposing artifacts that were frozen centuries ago, creating poignant full-circle moments, tools designed for harsh climates emerging as those climates warm. The cache contained fishing gear, fire steel, a CX knife, and woodworking implements, apparently abandoned by travelers caught in a sudden storm. Carbon dating placed the deposit at approximately 950 after Christ. The tools were in such good condition that after cleaning and minor restoration, they could function perfectly. The revival of traditional crafts during the 1900s brought renewed interest in Viking tool techniques. Arts and crafts movement designers studied medieval Scandinavian metalwork and woodworking, admiring its combination of functionality and beauty. Contemporary blacksmiths began recreating Viking Age implements, not as archaeological curiosities, but as functional tools. This experimental archaeology revealed surprises. Viking axes were lighter than modern forestry axes, but equally effective because their geometry was optimized differently. Viking whetstones cut faster than modern sharpening stones because their natural abrasive crystals were perfectly sized. Viking cooking cauldrons distributed heat more evenly than later iron pots because their smiths understood thermal properties intuitively. National identity movements in 19th and 20th century Scandinavia embraced Viking tools as symbols of cultural authenticity. Folk schools teaching traditional crafts proliferated across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. Students learned to forge knives using ancestral techniques, carve wood with period-appropriate tools, shear sheep with hand clippers, and spin wool on drop spindles. These weren't merely hobbyist pursuits, but deliberate cultural preservation, attempts to maintain threads connecting modern Scandinavians to their medieval ancestors. Some families maintained unbroken traditions. A Norwegian family in Telemark owns shears documented through parish records to the 1600s, probably descended from medieval predecessors. The modern bushcraft and survival communities represent an unexpected resurrection of Viking tool philosophy. Contemporary wilderness enthusiasts study historical implements because they recognize that solutions developed for Scandinavia's harsh environment remain relevant for survival situations anywhere. YouTube channels with millions of subscribers demonstrate how to use fire steel and flint, forge knives from raw materials, build shelters with hand tools, and fish with primitive gear. They're rediscovering, often unintentionally, the exact knowledge that sustained Viking Age families. Museums across Scandinavia now offer immersive experiences where visitors use replica Viking tools under expert guidance. You can shear sheep with authentic shears at the Lofotar Viking Museum in Norway, forge a simple knife at the Viking Ship Museum in Denmark, or split logs with traditional axes at Iceland's settlement exhibition. These programs reveal visceral truths that reading cannot convey: how much strength splitting wood requires, how skilled shearing sheep is, how challenging starting fire with flint and steel becomes in damp conditions. Modern participants gain profound respect for Vikings who performed these tasks daily while farming, trading, fighting, and raising families. The story of these 10 essential tools ultimately transcends Viking culture specifically to illuminate universal human themes. Every civilization requires implements to harvest food, create shelter, make clothing, prepare meals, and maintain effectiveness. The Vikings distinguished themselves not by inventing revolutionary tools, but by optimizing an integrated system where each implement complemented others, maximizing collective efficiency. This system-level thinking, understanding how components interact rather than focusing on individual excellence, explains their remarkable success in expanding from Scandinavia's harsh environment to controlled territory from Baghdad to Newfoundland. In 2025, 1,300 years after Vikings raided Lindisfarne, their tools persist. A farmer in Norway uses an axe whose design hasn't changed in a millennium. An Icelandic fisherman sets lines using techniques perfected in the Viking Age. A craftsperson in Minnesota descended from Norwegian immigrants forges knives using methods taught by her grandmother, who learned from her grandmother, in a teaching chain stretching back to medieval smiths. The longships rotted centuries ago, the warriors died, and the language evolved into modern Scandinavian tongues. But the tools endure silent testimony that true innovation isn't creating something entirely new, but understanding something fundamental so deeply that your solutions transcend their moment to serve human needs across centuries. The iron remains sharp, the knowledge persists, the heritage continues,